Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for all arriving on time. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Anita Talberg and I'm the Director of the Climate and Energy College. For those who do know me, you will have seen that since I came on board, I've had a bit of a climate engineering blitz. So there was my own seminar. We had Miranda Bircher speaking a few weeks ago, and now we're lucky to have Neil Craik. Neil's an associate professor at the University of Waterloo. He's in the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development, and he's a legal scholar. He focuses on the global commons, on climate change, on geoengineering, on environmental impact assessment. And I will give a bit of a shout out for his seminar that is tomorrow in the law school just down the road, where he'll be speaking a little bit more from the legal international law aspects, also on climate engineering. But today he's going to be talking to us about climate engineering in the context of the Paris Agreement. So he'll speak for 30, 40 minutes. Okay, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end, so please make him very welcome.
Thanks very much, Anita. Thank you for joining us this afternoon and spending a bit of your time with me today. And so, as Anita said, I'm going to talk about really the governance of climate engineering and its relationship to the Paris Agreement. And so why is this of interest to me? Principally for two reasons. The first one is that climate engineering is very clearly taking a much more prominent role in climate discussions and analysis. For those of you who read the recent 1.5 report, a chapter was dedicated to various forms of climate engineering, and it's forming increasingly part of the long-term modeling scenarios that the IPCC is using. If you follow these things, you might also know that just about a week or two ago in Nairobi, UN Environment entertained a resolution with respect to their governance of climate engineering, which was actually defeated from political pressure from the United States and Saudi Arabia. And so it's sort of becoming increasingly moving from the periphery really towards the center of climate discussions. And the second reason, of course, is that the Paris Agreement now is really the central institutional structure to address climate change internationally. It came into force very quickly. The so-called Paris Rulebook was agreed to in December of this past year. And so that particular structure is looking quite robust and appears to be with us at least for the next 10 or 15 years. And so the question that I and others have been interested in is to what extent the Paris Agreement can really provide an institutional framework for addressing issues related to climate engineering. Sorry for the quality of that. I'm not sure if it's me or many of you will be. So why are we talking about this? Many of you will be familiar with a graph or a graph similar to this. This is from the GAP report 2017, and really just what it shows is perhaps easier to see here, but this is sort of where we're getting to. And so this shows basically if all of the current commitments under the Paris Agreement, so the nationally determined contributions, if all of those commitments were actually complied with, then we're still a long way from where we need to be in terms of staying on a 2-degree, yet alone a 1.5-degree pathway. And so climate engineering to some degree is thought of as perhaps a set of technologies that can bridge the gap between where we get to with emission reductions and where we need to get to in terms of atmospheric GHG concentrations. So when we're talking about climate engineering, we tend to talk about two separate constellations of technology. So the first, carbon dioxide removal, are a set of technologies that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then store it in some particular way. This can be done biologically through afforestation and reforestation. It can be done It's sort of a mixture of technologies. So biomass energy and carbon capture and storage is growing feedstock, which would take in carbon and then create energy, but then those emissions would be sequestered. And there's a variety of different sort of chemical processes, but the key thing that, and the key way that carbon dioxide removal differs from other kinds of emission reductions is it really decouples emissions from the sources, both spatially and temporally, right? And so you can release emissions into the atmosphere and then capture them at some point later in the century, and you can do it in a different area, and that's a sort of crucial difference. The other form of technology, and I would say really a collection of what I would call hypothesized technologies, addresses not the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, but addresses radiative forcing. And so solar climate engineering, almost all of the technologies rely on some form of the Albedo effect and basically use different methods to reflect sunlight back into outer space, having a cooling effect. So this is a very similar, or really the same thing as when large volcanoes erupt. They put sulfates into the upper atmosphere. The sulfates are aerosols. They're reflective. They reflect sunlight away from the Earth's atmosphere and can have an overall cooling effect. And so a number of scientists have hypothesized that one way of addressing the heating part of climate change is by artificially cooling the Earth through different technologies. The two main ones that are being talked about are stratospheric aerosols, so putting aerosols into the upper stratosphere, and marine cloud brightening. And so using ways to create more whiter clouds in the marine environment. And again, white clouds have a reflective impact and could potentially cool the Earth. What are the potential roles that climate engineering could perform within the sort of broader portfolio of climate responses? And so again, this is from the GAP report. And really what it shows is the green is emission reductions. And so we can get, and so this, you can't see it, but it's the end of the century. So we can reduce significant amounts of emissions. The sort of yellow is our continued emissions. And then in order to get to kind of net zero, there would have to be removals of emissions. At this point, what this scenario shows and what most modeled scenarios show is that you might reach a sort of net zero. So the amount of emissions is balanced by the amount of removals, perhaps around 2080, and then you enter into a kind of net negative where you're actually reducing, you're drawing out more carbon dioxide than you're putting in, and that actually has some important policy implications. What happens here, of course, though, is you're getting more atmospheric carbon in the atmosphere that would take you beyond 2 degrees. And so one sort of simple schematic of thinking about how solar climate engineering might work is that as carbon dioxide removal takes some time to get you down to where you might want to get to, solar climate engineering could be used in addition to dampen the peak of warming, which could have some particular beneficial effects. But of course, all of these things have significant risks associated with them. And so the risks in relation to carbon dioxide removal, and carbon dioxide removal, right, because it's working on the carbon cycle, operates on the same sort of time scale. So it takes a long time operating on sort of hundreds of years of time scales, but also requires just a very large scale. So if I just go back here, if you look, it's hard to see the magnitude, but this particular model is predicting about 20 gigatons of removal by the end of the century. our current total emissions globally right now are approximately 40 gigatons. And so we're talking about removals that are potentially 25 to 50% of what we're currently emitting. So the scale is absolutely huge. Because of these different technologies have very significant impacts on things like land use. So bioenergy, carbon capture and storage requires huge amounts of land to grow feedstock. Direct air capture requires huge amounts of energy, high water requirements, and these imperil things like food security and have sort of downstream human rights effects as well, potentially, depending on how they're managed, and huge amounts of investment required, which I'll come back to, but sort of in the order of hundreds of billions of dollars per year in terms of what would actually be required to scale to the level that would be necessary to have the removals that are currently embedded in the models. Something just come up on this screen. Thanks. Solar radiation management probably has an even more troubling sets of risks associated with it because of the rapidity with which solar radiation management or solar climate engineering might work. One particular risk that I think is worth noting is what's called the termination effect. And so if you start solar climate engineering, then effectively what you're doing, right, particularly if you allow emissions to continue, what you're doing is just masking the warming, right? You're by sort of offsetting that warming artificially. What that means is if you ever stopped solar climate engineering, and the sort of timescales, again, as you can see, are sort of over sort of 75 to 200 years. So this is a very long undertaking. It's not something that would be done for 5 years. And so if that was stopped, what you would get is, because you have those gases in the atmosphere already, potential for very rapid rising, and that's got consequences because the ability to adapt to rapid rising is much more constrained than the ability to adapt to long-term temperature rises. While you can, solar climate engineering necessarily works globally, there's a bit of research on regional applications of solar climate engineering. So could you just do it in the Arctic or Antarctic to address ice melt and sea level change? And there's some possibility, but right now most of the models are just running on a kind of global scale. And what happens is, while you may distribute initially equally, the distribution of both temperature and precipitation patterns is uneven, just as it is in normal climate models. So what that means is effectively that there may be actually sort of global winners or losers with solar climate engineering, because some places may get dramatically or may be more impacted by cooling or changing precipitation patterns. I think the precipitation patterns in particular is of concerns, because if it disrupts very important regional precipitation patterns, again, there could be very high risks associated with that. Solar climate engineering doesn't do anything for other CO2 impacts, so ocean acidification, these kinds of things, right? It just works on warming. It doesn't work on other effects. There's some specific concerns about stratospheric aerosols and their interaction with the ozone. There's a team at Harvard, it's called the Harvard Climate Engineering Project, which you can sort of look up online. They have an experiment that's probably going to go ahead later this year or early next year in Arizona, where they're going to, really the first outdoor experiment on solar climate engineering, where they're going to spray some aerosols and take some measurements. And principally what they're interested in is sort of aerosol ozone interactions. High degrees of uncertainty and high degrees of scale dependency. And so you can do small scale experiments, but then you're not 100% sure as you scale that those same those same impacts will work linearly, right? And so you have to sort of experiment. And so one of the ways in which solar climate engineering is sort of framed is that it's necessarily at all scales kind of an experimental, and so to some degree it is sort of experimenting with the Earth, and I think that raises a whole series of other concerns. There's a broad range of social and ethical concerns, and I'm sorry I'm not spending a lot of time on like these. Each of these things could, someone could speak for an hour on each of these things, but I'm just trying to get us to the Paris Agreement, and so I'm not, by spending a small amount of time on these, I'm not suggesting the gravity of these concerns and the complexity of these concerns. There's a kind of moral hazard around climate engineering, because does climate engineering then provide incentives for us to do less of what we need to do, which is to reduce emissions? And it should be clear that no one is suggesting climate engineering as an alternative to emissions reduction. Everyone who is sort of serious in this field recognizes that emission reduction is the most important thing, and climate engineering, whether it's CDR or solar, will play some sort of supplementary role, but as part of a broader portfolio of climate responses. Nonetheless, it may move resources away, may move political attention away, and may provide some political cover. And even in the models, if you put a lot of climate engineering into models, it sort of looks like you're doing better than you are, because you're relying on some future activity to make the models actually resolve in the proper way, which I'll talk about. There's concerns around technological lock-in, that we just actually get fixed into some suboptimal technology because it works soonest, and so stratospheric aerosols, and then we implement them and we can't unimplement them, and so do we get some sort of technological lock-in? Are we concerned about researchers or commercial interests having some sort of vested interest in promoting a particular technology without providing for the kind of thoughtful debate that is necessary here? There's a kind of sort of techno-fix hubris that I think inevitably gets raised with these sort of technologically driven responses to climate change. There's a set of democratic concerns, particularly with solar climate engineering, really along the lines of, can we actually conceive of a way where we could govern a technology that influences the global climate in the way it does, in a kind of intentional, purposeful way, in a way that's consistent with democracy? And again, there's a lot of debate around those kinds of issues. And then again, those sort of distributive concerns that I talked about earlier. So how do you deal with the winners and losers? And what I mean by no subsidiarity is, unlike genetically modified organisms, a country conceivably can say no to them. Europe has said no to a lot of GMOs, whereas Australia and Canada have largely, I think Australia, like Canada, has said yes. But countries can make their own decisions. Countries can't make their own decisions about solar climate engineering, right? It's a global technology, it's with global implications. And so there has to be a way of thinking about the sort of democratic ways and ethical ways in which those decisions are being made. And so the Paris Agreement, I don't think I need to say much about the Paris Agreement. It's a legally binding treaty. The most important thing about the Paris Agreement, of course, is its architecture. And so unlike the Kyoto Protocol, which really had a sort of top-down architecture whereby states negotiated reduction targets and timetables, here it's got a bottom-up structure, right? So states are free to determine for themselves what their commitments will be, but they're subject to sort of oversight and political pressure through a number of mechanisms under the Paris Agreement. Now, this is all contained within a set of objectives in terms of reaching a sort of 2 or 1.5 degree target, but the structure itself is very much state-driven through what are called nationally determined contributions. As I said in the last conference of the parties, they agreed to the implementing rules for the most part. And so we'll begin to see over the next couple of years the agreement come into full force and effect in terms of how it works. And so what I'm going to do next is really sort of take you through a number of provisions, not sort of word by word, and just talk a little bit about how these provisions might be used in a way that may affect the governance of climate engineering. I'm principally going to speak to carbon dioxide removal for reasons that will become evident, but largely because there's not a lot of purchase for solar climate engineering under the Paris Agreement. And so most international agreements have preambles. The Paris Agreement has a preamble. So preambles are those statements before the actual binding part of a treaty, but provide the sort of framing and objectives of the treaty. Of particular note in the Paris Agreement is some framing around equity, common but differentiated responsibilities, and so the different responsibilities of developed versus developing states, but also a very strong recognition and link to the relationship between climate change and human rights. And as I mentioned very briefly, carbon dioxide removal and certainly solar climate engineering have the potential to impact all sorts of different human rights. And so access to land, right to food, right to water, right to life, I think is potentially implicated by solar climate engineering. And so again, there's nothing determinative in a preamble. That's not how preambles work, but they provide a kind of interpretive guidance to the parties and play a strong rhetorical role in the discussion amongst the parties. And I think it's clear that the discussion around climate engineering will need to be framed in recognition of the human rights implications of these technologies and their implementation. That's important because I think those are significant constraints. And so one thing that models don't control for, models tend not to control for things like the level of social acceptability and coherence with these kinds of rights. So models tend to model the how much carbon dioxide removal we can do using sort of some kind of cost optimization formula. And so again, the models may be more optimistic because they don't account for the degree of concern. And again, we've seen, we have some experience with this with the clean development mechanism, sort of large scale emission removal technologies and sink technologies, where it became evident to many people that as they were being implemented, they were having some important human rights implications, and that had to be factored into discussions. This is just, again, sort of showing what I showed you earlier, just a sort of scale of impact from carbon dioxide removal. So again, the most important thing about the Paris Agreement are the Paris targets, right? So this 2 degrees, 1.5 degree target. So the target is to aim to achieve 1.5, but to certainly not exceed 2 degrees is sort of how that target is framed. This graph here shows a set of basically integrated assessment models, sort of some different model runs. The ones that we're interested in are the blue ones because they're the models that run to approximately 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide. So those are the models that are consistent with a 2 degree pathway. So these are the IPCC models. So 101 of 116 models consistent with 2 degrees used by the IPCC included large amounts of bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. And you can see this in the model. And so what happens in these models is that all of them, as they dip below the emissions, what these are showing are negative emissions, right? So they're showing scenarios where you actually have to sort of draw out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so these are actually sort of net emissions. And again, what you see in this model is you know, something in the order of sorry, I'm not sure what's on that side of my graph because I can't actually read the slide. But large amounts of negative emissions, consistent with about, again, as I said, sort of 10 to 20 gigatons per annum of removal. Why is this important? I mean, this is important because, in effect, what the models are doing is they're relying on carbon dioxide removal, but we really don't have any idea whether these removals will materialize. Right, so there's still a high degree of technological uncertainty about these. Probably more important is the cost uncertainty, and so can we actually get the removals at the scale we need at a cost that is acceptable? And so right now, with direct air capture, which is a technology that uses sort of chemical means to pull carbon dioxide from the air, so essentially scrub carbon dioxide out of the air and sequester it. And people are talking in the sort of neighborhood of $100 to $200 a ton to do this, depending on which technology you use, which is probably not cost competitive at this particular time. And then, of course, the whole the social acceptability. We have a great deal of uncertainty about the level of social acceptability of these. The other concern, and I'll talk about this in greater detail, is this notion of overshoot, right? And so what you're doing by going into net negative territory is what you're assuming in your models is there will be a portion of time when the temperature will be greater than 2 degrees because the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 are higher, but they'll be drawn down over time. But as you draw down over time, you're still exceeding your target. And again, how acceptable is that? What are the implications of actually doing that? So let me talk a little bit more in detail about what we refer to as overshoot. And again, just to sort of, this is a kind of a stylized graph of what you saw on the previous page, right? So this is the sort of just net negative emissions. And so you have this period of drawdown where you have net negative emissions, which corresponds on temperature to a both an exceedance of 2 degrees for a certain period of time and a certain amount. And so what we don't know is the duration, and what we don't know is the magnitude of that. Now, of course, not exceeding 2 degrees and exceeding 2 degrees and getting back to 2 degrees 50 or 75 years later are two very different things. And so, and this was pointed out, this is just a quote from the Convention on Biological Diversity Secretariat, but there's a concern around tipping points and feedback mechanisms that if you allow countries to exceed 2 degrees and on the assumption that they're going to draw it back, that may be insufficient, right? Because sea level rise may also, will continue. And there's all sorts of effects that you just can't undo by suddenly bringing yourself back to 450 parts per million. Can the Paris Agreement control exceedances? And so one of the things that has been suggested by a number of people is one of the things the Paris Agreement ought to do is actually control for the duration and magnitude of overshoot. So one possibility, just given the wording of the agreement, is to say you can exceed 1.5, but you cannot go over 2 degrees for any period of time. Which might seem quite sensible given what we know about the implications of exceeding 2 degrees. So one way to read Article 2 is to say that you actually can't exceed 2 degrees in any particular manner, but Article 2 is an objective. It's not actually an obligation. So states don't have an obligation to meet 2 degrees or to act consistently with 2 degrees. 2 degrees is the objective, and then their obligation is to take steps through their nationally determined contributions. The problem with nationally determined contributions, these NDCs, is that, as I said before, they're driven from the bottom up, so states have a high degree of discretion, and so they're largely self-regulatory, and so it's going to be very hard in the aggregate to actually control for magnitude and duration of overshoot. It would probably require, if it doesn't require an amendment to the agreement, it would certainly require very specific agreement among the parties to be implemented through a decision of the Conference of the Parties. There was a lot of debate in the sort of 10 years of negotiations leading up to the Paris Agreement around burden sharing. And so much of the collapse of the Copenhagen Accord was really triggered around burden sharing. So how much would developed states be responsible for in relation to developing states? And there was a significant debate around the degree of responsibility that developing states ought to take, particularly large emitter developing states. That was all sort of put behind the international community with the Paris Agreement, because they really agreed to this sort of bottom-up approach, which allowed states to decide for themselves what their commitments would be. But again, if we think about CDR, there's clearly going to be really important distributive consequences where you can actually grow the feedstock, where you can, where it makes sense to have bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So you need a number of geological factors which may not be tied to things like historic responsibility or tied to development status. And so who's got the right kind of pore space? Who has the right kind of ecosystems to grow feedstock, these kinds of things. This model run, which was a very rough one, just basically using a sort of cost optimized scenario. So basically, when would BECCS make sense from a cost scenario given your energy mix and things like that? But what it shows roughly is that where it makes sense to do carbon dioxide removal from an economic perspective isn't going to follow along a developed and developing state scenario. And so again, I think what carbon dioxide removal does is it sort of puts burden sharing back on, not that burden sharing in a sense was ever off the table, but I think it's going to bring it into sharper relief. Particularly when you think about the challenges associated with burden sharing in a net negative emissions world, right? And so net negative emissions means that some countries are drawing down more than they're emitting, so they're below zero in terms of their net emissions. And so what are the incentives for a state to actually do that, which suggests that you actually need some market mechanisms to provide those kinds of incentives in order to get that kind of distribution. So what about the NDCs? So again, NDCs, nationally determined contributions. So this is under the agreement. These are the commitments, but they're not called commitments because they're not legally binding. So they're called contributions that the states, so there's sort of political commitments that the states lodge with the other parties to say, this is what we're going to do, this is how, and so everyone can see the burdens and the steps that states are taking to address climate change. And so one big question is to what extent climate engineering can be integrated into NDCs. We're already seeing a bit of that with afforestation and reforestation, right? And so, which we sort of think of as sinks and reservoirs, but is also a form of climate engineering. And when you look at the definitions of a sink under the UNFCCC, it's at least it was clear to me and my co-author Will Burns that that CDR will largely be incorporated into NDCs over time as these technologies develop. This seems to be the emerging consensus among the scientific community, and so the National Academy of Sciences, in a large report on carbon dioxide removal technologies issued last year, basically said there's really no point in making this distinction between carbon dioxide removal and other forms of emission reductions. They're going to compete with one another on a cost basis, and they can be integrated into the NDC process. One concern I think that we need to keep our eye on is the possibility that states will over-rely on carbon dioxide removal in order to justify unambitious emission reduction commitments in their NDCs, right? So essentially say, well, we're only going to reduce by this much, but in the latter part of the century, we're going to do all sorts of CDR. And so right now, it's unclear that there would be a mechanism for the parties to review those NDCs and say, well, we think that there's an overly ambitious or unjustified, either technologically or another basis, reliance on carbon dioxide removal. There is what's called a progressivity requirement under the agreement, which means parties have to lodge new NDCs every 5 years, and every 5 years they have to be more ambitious. And so what they can't do is backpedal, so there's a kind of ratcheting mechanism that's built into the Paris Agreement. And again, one question, I think an interpretive question that needs to be answered is, to what degree does progressivity really apply to emission reductions and not to carbon dioxide removal? Again, I think the bottom-up structure of the Paris Agreement makes this very hard, right? States will determine for themselves that mix. That really is the structure. The only mechanism, the only really collective mechanism is the global stocktake, which I'll talk about. But so there is a mechanism where they kind of look collectively at all the NDCs to sort of assess whether they're going to get to the level of meeting the objectives. One of the things that Will Burns and I suggested is, should there be a kind of supplementarity requirement built into the NDCs? By supplementarity, I mean, should CDR be seen as supplemental to emission reductions, and therefore put limits on the amount of CDR that can be depended upon? There is another tool which hasn't received a lot of attention under the Paris Agreement called low GHG emission development strategies, so LGDSs, because everything in the climate world has an acronym. And so what's interesting is, I think of the 10 of these that have been filed, and these are, I don't think every state has to file one, but a number of particularly developed states have. And at least 3 states on our reading their long-term GHG development strategy. So these are, Canada's is out to the year 2050, include a recognition that there will need to be a reliance on CDR. And so these actually might be quite a useful tool in terms of measuring this, because you can actually look out quite far and actually make assessments on whether the reliance on CDR is also being accompanied by things like research and development support and infrastructure support to support those emissions. The market mechanism under Paris is very uncertain right now. It was the one part of the agreement where they couldn't agree to implementing rules because Brazil had this strange position that they wanted to double count emissions that they were going to sell to other countries, count them for themselves, and then allow them to be counted when they sold them, which didn't make sense. But it was, but anyway, why are markets important? Markets are important, again, because of the scale of CDR and probably the need for private capital to actually implement CDR at the scales necessary. And so one estimation is $160 billion a year by 2050. This will require CDR to be integrated into market structures. A need for clear signals about which technologies will be acceptable, which technologies won't be acceptable. So there's been a number of Proto experiments on ocean fertilization, so putting substances into the ocean to promote plankton growth, which would then promote photosynthesis, capture CO2, and then be sequestered as the phytoplankton sink to the bottom of the ocean. These are very risky, again, at the sort of scales necessary, and a lot of concerns about ocean ecosystems. And so, but we need to there needs to be a way to send clear signals to people that, so one happened in Canada, and the proponent of this thing was basically said, well, we're going to get all sorts of carbon credits for this. But again, there has to be a way to signal to people that that's not going to happen. There's a set of accounting challenges, right? The same kind of accounting challenges that you'll have with emission reductions. So you actually need methodologies and protocols to actually understand how much carbon dioxide you're removing from the atmosphere and storing, and in order to get markets to work, you actually have to know how much the quantity of the thing that you're presumably getting paid for, and a broader set of concerns around sustainability requirements. And then there's a set of finance concerns. And so can you use the climate finance provisions of the Paris Agreement to facilitate CDR development? And to what degree will CDR meet the development needs of developing countries, which is part of what the climate finance mechanism is doing as well, right? It's a development mechanism as well as a way to finance emission reductions. And so again, right now we don't know what those rules are going to look like, but as different technologies come on stream, the parties will have to consider and develop those rules, probably on a technology by technology basis. And finally, loss and damage. And so in addition to dealing with emission reductions, the Paris Agreement deals with adaptation and also what's called loss and damage. So adaptation, again, this is just from a paper by Ken Caldera showing a sort of different stages of the carbon cycle. And so adaptation, once there's actually, you have climate impacts, then adaptation are those steps that are taken to respond to those impacts in ways to make those impacts less harmful, or to human and ecosystem requirements. Loss and damage really deals with where there are going to be impacts that are not adaptable, so there just will be harm. And so how do states get compensated, and to what degree can states get compensated for that harm, or what's the global response in the face of climate harm? To some degree, solar climate engineering can be interpreted as a form of adaptation, right? It looks adaptive, right? Well, there's going to be warming, and so we can do these things to actually lessen the impact of warming by artificially cooling the planet. I just point out that it really operates at a different stage of the of the carbon cycle. And so whereas adaptation really addresses once you actually have climate change and it impacts Earth systems, solar geoengineering is actually preventing those impacts from occurring. So it doesn't fit very well in adaptation. It certainly wasn't anticipated by the parties. And so really the only one place where solar climate engineering might fit into the Paris Agreement, we've argued it's a poor interpretive fit into the agreement. And certainly none of the provisions would really help. Loss and damage, on the other hand, I think is worth looking at quite carefully, and really for two reasons. It's the one place where there actually can be a kind of collective response. And there's two ways that this could work. So one might be to think about whether solar climate engineering is a collective response that would fit under Article 8, in the sense that it's addressing slow onset events, extreme weather, these kinds of things. So it seems to fit into the kinds of things that might be done. There's a mechanism called the Warsaw International Mechanism, which deals with loss and damage. right now the rules are very uncertain, and it's certainly just a sort of conjecture on our part that it may fit here. But I think thinking about a mechanism which requires a collective response is probably going to be important as solar climate engineering research moves forward. The other way that it might provide an interesting model is to deal with the impacts from solar climate engineering were it ever to be implemented. Because of the uneven distribution, it may be that certain countries will suffer harm as a result of solar climate engineering. Liability would be a very difficult tool. It's a very difficult tool in international law to deal with international liability from state activities. But loss and damage provides a kind of alternative mechanism to liability, provides perhaps a mechanism to compensate states that are negatively affected, and may also be used as a way to kind of create side agreements that would allow solar climate engineering to be an acceptable solution for some states, acknowledging the fact that some states may not benefit from the activity. I'm going to sort of wrap things up because I just want to save a few minutes. And so transparency is important, and the transparency mechanisms will be important. The IPCC is going to play a critical role. One of the big dynamics at the United Nations Environment meeting the other week was the United States was apparently arguing one of the reasons that they don't want UN Environment to deal with climate engineering is because they think the IPCC is the appropriate place for it to be dealt with. The IPCC has dealt with it a little bit in the 1.5 report. They're going to deal with CDR extensively on their report being issued later this year on climate change and land use. And I think AR6 will probably have a fairly significant amount of climate engineering in it. Again, I speculate, but that's, I think, reasonable. So in terms of a conclusion, the Paris Agreement is absolutely critical for CDR, and I think what we'll see is CDR being integrated into the Paris Agreement, very limited ability to address solar climate engineering. The bottom-up architecture presents a number of serious challenges, but the Paris Agreement institutions will be critical in meeting those challenges, particularly the meeting of the parties and the IPCC. But they all, particularly the parties themselves, use a consensus decision-making process, which will be very challenging in the context of both CDR and solar geoengineering. And it's very clear that climate engineering extends beyond the Paris Agreement. It impacts oceans, it impacts biological diversity, it impacts human rights. So there will be a demand for sort of inter-regime coherency in addition to the Paris Agreement. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Neil. That was really interesting. I think you face the same dilemma that Miranda and I face, which is you spend the first half an hour just trying to explain to everyone what is climate engineering.
I should say, we have if you Google Craik and Burns, my co-author, Center for International Governance Innovation, there's a paper there that we wrote a couple years ago that largely is this talk, and I think we have another paper under review, so there hopefully will be another paper out in 6 months' time.
We can put that link up on the past events on our website as well. But we do have time for a few questions. Are there any questions in the audience? Yeah, there's a microphone just coming to you.
Did you look into energy consumption? Because you've been talking a lot about mostly money to be spent to develop those technologies, but I read a report that say that for capturing carbon from the air, it will just require a huge amount of energy, like I think something like twice the amount of currently produced energy on Earth. Do you have a...
Right. So, I mean, I personally haven't, because I'm a legal scholar, but yes, there have been studies, and I think my slides reference some of those studies, and certainly with direct air capture, energy consumption is probably the biggest barrier. It takes a lot of energy to actually do depending on the technology. So right now there's a Canadian company called Carbon Engineering that is using carbon capture to create gasoline. And so they're capturing carbon dioxide and then they're actually making a fuel out of it. So it's not net negative, right? But it's neutral, but I think they see it as a first step. And so the idea is that if you were going to power direct air capture, you'd have to power it with renewables. So a big feasibility question there.
Any other questions? All right, we'll go to David first.
Neil, thanks for a great overview talk, and I could ask you lots of different questions. I'll go with the interesting one, which is related to loss and damage. So far, in terms of climate change, there's been lots of it and not many successful loss and damage claims.
Yeah.
For geoengineering associated with solar radiation management, you've suggested that it's more risk, and I would agree with that, and that loss and damage might be successful potentially, or at least in managing it, yet the short time scales for which loss and damage claims might be needed to avert damage associated with solar radiation management are going to be much, much shorter than the real legal timescales for demonstrating clear damage associated with solar radiation management experiments. How are you going to cope with that in the legal system?
Yeah, I mean, and I want to be clear. What I'm not saying is loss and damage is a solution, and I'm certainly not saying that that we shouldn't have to worry about the potential damages arising from this because there's this mechanism. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that I think liability. So there's been a number of papers saying, well, this can just be dealt with standard liability rules, and we're seeing this, with sort of climate lawsuits and stuff. I'm less optimistic than many of my colleagues around how ultimately successful climate litigation will be. And so there's been a lot of positive developments with Urgenta and Our Children's Trust, which are cases in the United States and Netherlands. But none of those have actually, with the exception of Urgenta, which I think is under appeal maybe, none of them have actually progressed to an ultimate resolution. Loss and damage is a kind of alternative, right, where you wouldn't have to necessarily prove direct causality, which is almost impossible with solar climate engineering, right? Because once you're just intervening in the weather system, the causal connections are just too diffuse and attenuated to actually get something that would be close to legal causality. But I think it's a recognition that causality and straight liability is a poor way to deal with both climate damages and to deal with these kinds of damages. So my only suggestion is that loss and damage might provide a better mechanism. And if we're thinking about it, and I think one of the things we do have to think about before we get close to moving ahead with solar climate engineering is to think about how people who are negatively affected by a technology are going to be addressed, and if not made whole, at least be addressed in some sort of morally acceptable manner. And I just think that loss and damage, we might be better off thinking about it in those less formalistic and legal terms and deal with it more as a kind of political problem, which is, I think, what loss and damage is trying to do.
Hi, I'm Ian Blair. I'm just wondering whether some of the more immediate type problems of pollution, plastics, that all are commons related, we've got population growth, if we use them as sort of pilot trials to see if we can get some control, because for instance, pollution might be 30% reduction in that, food loss another 30%, so that we get some, if you like, they're low-hanging fruit. If we can't solve those immediate problems, what hope have we got of doing the large-scale geo engineering? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we have some experience in dealing with collective action problems, and I think what we found out when we look at collective action problems is that our success in addressing them is highly contextual. And so ozone, there were certain aspects to the ozone problem that made it that made the solutions more tractable than they have been for climate change, the availability of alternatives, for example. And so I think what you're suggesting, can we look at other collective action problems and use some of the lessons learned when we then realize that, you know, we have bigger and perhaps more complicated collective action problems? And I would say those are useful things to do, but I think we have to recognize that each of these problems will have its own characteristics, and we probably can't rely on our success. That was a little bit, you know, the problem with the Kyoto Protocol. It relied to a high degree on a model that was successful in ozone, applied it to climate change without accounting for the fact that they were actually very different kinds of problems. I think the way it'll be addressed is more of a scaling issue, that it'll start small and there'll be lessons to be learned as things scale. I think that's probably reasonably manageable. I don't think it's a problem, a different kind of problem with CDR. I think with solar, it's just a completely different kind of problem, which requires, you know, just much more deeper kinds of complexities.
And I might add my own sort of question, feeding on, I guess, from that, is the experience we've seen in Australia recently in that solar geoengineering space is actually, you referred to the Peter Irvine paper at the beginning about looking at maybe Arctic or Antarctic interventions, but what we've seen in Australia is very localized cooling, for example, in marine areas to protect the Great Barrier Reef. Right. So then again, that's, I mean, it's a question of scaling up, yes, but it sort of slips under the radar a little bit in terms of the global context.
Yeah, and so my understanding, and again, I'm not a scientist, I want to be careful, my understanding based on my non-expert reading of papers written by experts is that they are modeling regional impacts, and I think it is technology dependent in the sense that cirrus cloud stripping looks like it might be a better technology for some regional applications. Stratospheric aerosols less so because they disperse, right? They disperse globally. And I think marine cloud brightening, they just don't understand enough about cloud telecommunications to really understand what would happen. And so I think the models will work, but they'll have to be field experiments to actually inform, to get better models to actually to answer that question.
Thanks, Neil. I'm going to ask you to one more round of applause from Neil, but first I will just point you to our upcoming seminars that you can't read there, but I'll tell you about them. So tonight, the Beyond Zero Emissions is hosting an event that we're co-hosting. It's over in the School of Earth Sciences, and that's from Elisa de Wit, who is also a lawyer, and she's going to be talking a little bit about the Rocky Hill Coal project that I'm sure you would have seen was in the courts, was in the papers recently. Then we have the beginning of our 6 seminar series hosted by Ross Garneau, well, with Ross Garneau speaking. That's the first one's on the 3rd of April. It's in Carrillo-Gantner, and it's very well subscribed, so make sure you go onto the website and subscribe if you are interested in coming. And he'll be starting to unpick the energy debate as we go into the election in May, and that's the first of that 6 seminar series. And then we have another, having a bit of a law month, we have another legal scholar talking to us more about gas developments and some of the recent work that's been done in New South Wales. But I'll ask you to thank Neil for that presentation, and I'm sure you'll hang around for a little bit if anyone has any questions.
Yeah.